Hi, 18 Cinema Summary here. In this video, we are going to tell you the complete recap of a movie called Milena. The movie tells a story of a 13-year-old boy, who is fascinated with Milena, the most beautiful woman in town. Every day, the boy never stops stalking Milena. But, in that town, Milena is mistreated because of her beauty. He is bullied, raped, and slandered. How will their story unfold? Spoils ahead. Watch out and take care. There is a boy named Renato, a 13-year-old boy who receives his new bike. Renato rides back to his friends. When he arrives, they ask him to sit on the side. They are mesmerized as they watch Milena walk down the street. Milena is the daughter of their Latin teacher, Professor Bonsignori. As she moves past them, the group speeds away on their bikes multiple times, trying to keep their eyes on her. Renato stares intensely at her and admires her beauty. Later on, they head to their Latin class. Renato contemplates the whole day, still in awe at Milena's beauty. The next day, Renato skips school and rides to Milena's house, where he daydreams about Milena calling out to him and asking for cigarettes. However, his daydream is cut short as he stares at Milena's house with the doors closed. At home, his father is furious at him for skipping school. Later that night, Renato sneaks out of his room and goes to Milena's house. He climbs a tree, peeps through a hole in the window, and looks inside the house, finding Milena lying on a couch. He watches Milena walk around listening to the music before he spots a photo of her husband, Nino Scordia. On the following day, the men talk about Milena and how she arrived in their town without Nino, who's currently fighting in the war. After his haircut, Renato goes back to Milena's house, spying on her with a telescope and watching her all day long. Later in the night, Renato comes to Milena's house, peeking through a hole to watch her. Later on, she starts dancing with a picture of Nino while a song plays in the background. The following day, Renato heads to the music store and buys a copy of the song playing in Milena's house. Once home, he plays the song while looking at crude photos of women and imagines them all as Milena. The following day, Renato rejoins his friends as they race to find Milena again. Then he makes up an excuse to leave his friends before catching up to Milena. When he sees her, the men from the town are watching her walk along the road. Suddenly, a dentist, Dr. Cusimano, greets her, kissing her hand. Moving on, Milena stares at Lieutenant Cade. As she arrives at her destination, Renato sees her catching a key for a door. Later on, Renato heads to a repairer to fix his bike, and from there, he spots Milena again. Renato is still amazed by her beauty, while the women in the town, sickened by Milena's presence. One of the women compares her to Gina, an escort in the city. Milena heads for the apartment again, with Renato still following her. He then climbs the gate nearby, revealing it to be her father. During their morning exercise, one of Renato's friends informs that Nino Scordia has died in the battle. Later, Renato attends a memorial for Nino. After leaving, Renato returns to Professor Bonsignori's apartment and sees Milena in bed, crying in grief over the loss of her husband. In Renato's imagination, he goes to Milena's side, comforting and assuring her that he'll be there for her before Milena hugs him. After the funeral procession, the townspeople gossip and slandering Milena, angering Renato and spurring him to spit in their drinks and urinate in their bags. After leaving, Renato soon spots Milena leave a store. The men from the store talk about her crudely, and when Renato overhears this, he throws a rock at the store, then riding away. After that, Renato sits close to Milena's house. When Milena enters her home, Renato walks over to her yard and grabs a pair of her undergarments. The next day, Renato's father walks into Renato's room and finds him still asleep with the underwear draped over his head. His father throws a fit, telling Renato that he's ashamed of him while the rest of Renato's family catches on. After scolding him, Renato's father locks him inside his room while Renato's mother burns the underwear. After 3 days pass, Renato's mother is concerned for her son, who hasn't eaten yet. The following day, a doctor visits Renato to check on him, informing him that he needs fresh air outside. Afterward, Renato rides his bike to Milena's house again. The streets are now filled with other men staring at Milena's home. In the middle of the class, suddenly a man comes in and hands a letter to Professor Bonsignori. The letter tells that his daughter has been sleeping with the whole town. Heartbroken, the professor leaves his class, and the students are left to gossip about the letter. Insulted, Renato fights one of the students. At night, Renato returns to Milena's home and finds Lieutenant Cade inside Milena's house. Renato is angered by what he sees, especially when Lieutenant Cade kisses Milena. On his way out, the lieutenant bumps into Dr. Cusimano. The dentist berates him for pestering Milena, who he calls his fiancée. Dr. Cusimano slaps Lieutenant Kade first, then they two fight until Dr. Cusimano's wife arrives with the police. Then the police started arresting the two fools. The next day, the town people gossip about last night's incident, arguing who was at fault. Many express their shock over Milena supposedly having two lovers. They mention that the professors already quit their teaching position in disgrace. People also point out that Milena should go to court because of the lure of a married man. Back in her father's apartment, Milena tries to unlock the door, but the key doesn't fit. Renato watches and realizes that the professor has given up on his daughter. Later on, Milena walks to Attorney Centorbi's office, asking for counsel before proceeding to court. Inside the busy courtroom, Renato watches while Milena's put to trial. The judge proceeds to ask Milena questions about the dentist and their relationship. Milena tells the judge that Dr. Cusimano only visited her once to give medicine for her father, and he lied about being her fiancé. When the judge asks about Lieutenant Kade, Milena tells him that their relationship is no law concern. He asks his clerk to report Lieutenant Kade's statement. Disappointed, Milena listens while the clerk informs everyone that Lieutenant Kade had a casual view of his relationship with Milena. Attorney Centorbi then starts speaking passionately, defending Milena and blaming Dr. Cusimano as Milena's only sin is her beauty. She only wants to live a new life after her loss. Later on, Milena and Centorbi happily head back and dance while Renato watches from the window. Centorbi suddenly makes his move on her. He tells her that the only payment he wants is Milena herself. Renato moves to another place to find a better view, but it breaks, making the boy fall. The next day at school, Renato continues to think about Milena and imagine his professor as Milena. Afterward, Renato is with his family in the tailor, to find long pants fit for him. Leaving the tailor, Renato then spies on Centorbi, who is visiting his mother. He laughs when his mother hits him in disapproval of Milena. After that, Renato follows Attorney and finds him together with Milena. There they end their relationship. This fills Renato with relief. After this, Renato continues to follow Milena while men along the streets are bugging her. All of a sudden, she slows down. When Renato sees this, he thinks that Milena is walking towards him. To his disappointment, Milena walks past him and approaches Antonio, a man who gives her food. Suddenly, there is an explosion in that town. After the bombing run, Renato runs to one of the destroyed buildings, where soldiers pull Professor Bonsignori's body. Shortly after, Milena, together with her father's students, join the funeral procession. After the funeral, Milena returns home and starts cutting her hair. While Renato is watching outside, a car suddenly drives up to Milena's house, making Renato hide. Antonio knocks on Milena's door, and Milena welcomes him inside. From the hole in the window, Renato is in tears as he watches Antonio immediately force himself on Milena. Renato then comes back home in his rage. The day after, Renato walks along with the city. Seeing Milena, her beauty completely mesmerized him as Milena now has red hair. The men around her look in amazement, and the women look at her cynically. While she makes her way to a table, she starts to get a cigarette, and all the men around her offer a lighter. The next day, Renato watches inside the barbershop, see Milena with blonde hair. Renato imagines what Milena does with them in their hotel before he eventually passes out because of stress. Renato's parents take him to the church where they have him exorcise, as his mother believes that the devil possesses him. From the outside, Renato's father cries and believes that Renato only needs to sleep with a woman to cure him. After the rituals, Renato's father takes him to a brothel, and inside, Renato carefully chooses a woman. The two then move up to a room where they begin hooking up. Suddenly, a group of women storms a building, and they pull out Milena. The women start beating her on the streets, and they tear off her clothes. Renato couldn't do a thing as the women cut her hair. Once they are done, Milena is left helpless and bloodied, crying out in pain and humiliation before the women cast her out of town. Shortly after, Renato rides to a train station and sees Milena boarding without ever speaking with a woman he yearns for the most. Renato watches her leaves. Back in town, a car stops, and a man steps out of it. As he is walking along the streets, the people recognize him, revealing the man to be Nino Scordia, Milena's supposedly dead husband. Renato follows Nino enter his former home. Surprised to find refugees there and that his wife had disappeared. Renato continues to follow Nino while he makes his way into an office. There, he realizes what happened to Nino. It turns out he survives the war, and everyone in this town spreads hoaxes about his die. Nino then desperately asks the officer to help him find his wife. At night, Nino returns to his home, sitting by the bed. Nino is in deep thought when suddenly Renato drops a letter beside him. Nino tries to run after the boy. He learns that Milena had always been faithful to him. With his discovery, Nino boards a train while Renato watches. Time passes, and the town goes on with its usual day. Renato is with a girl. Everyone stops and stares at Nino. He reunites with his wife Milena, returning to Castel Cudo. The townspeople could only watch the couple in awe, and they ignore everyone as they head back to their home. Afterward, in the market, Milena walks, and a dozen people stare at her. Once Milena finished shopping, Renato comes up on his bike, and he watches Milena from far away. On her journey home, some of the tomatoes fall from her bag. Renato helps her, causing his hand to brush against hers. Finally, he speaks to her and wishes her good luck. Milena nods and walks away. And that wraps up our recap this time for the movie Milena. Feel free to drop a comment below as to what we should recap next. Thank you for watching.